Syrian Arab Airlines, operating as Syrian Air, is the flag carrier airline of Syria. It operates scheduled international services to several destinations in Asia, Europe and North Africa, though the number of flights operated has seriously declined since 2011 due to the Arab Spring and subsequent Syrian war. Syrian Air previously served over 50 destinations worldwide. Its main bases are Damascus International Airport and previously Aleppo International Airport. Syrian Air is a member of the Arab Air Carriers Organization and Arabesque Airline Alliance. The company has its head office on the 5th floor of the Social Insurance Building in Damascus. History. Early years. Syrian Airways 1946 to 1958. Syrian Airlines was established in autumn 1946, with 2 propeller aircraft and started to fly between Damascus, Aleppo and Deir ez-Zor and Al-Qamishli. Operations began in 1947. Financial difficulties caused the suspension of services in 1948, but after receiving government support, operations were resumed in 1951. The airline expanded during the next years to include Beirut, Baghdad, and Jerusalem, then Cairo and Kuwait, then Doha, in addition to flights during the Hajj. The airline started its operations in June 1947 using 2 Beech D-18s and 3 Douglas DC-3. The Dakotas had been acquired from Pan American World Airways, which provided technical assistance to Syrian Airways during the very first years of operation. The airline's domestic network linked Damascus, Aleppo, Latakia, Qamishli and Palmyra. Syrian Airways also operated a regional network, with flights to Beirut, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Amman, followed by Cairo, Kuwait, Doha and Jeddah. In May 1948, the war in Palestine and financial difficulties led to the withdrawal of power and to the suspension of service until the summer of 1952. On December 21, 1953, one of the airline's Douglas planes crashed near Damascus, killing all 9 aboard. The airline's operating permit was cancelled following the crash. The airline was allowed to fly again in 1954. The D-18s had been returned to the Syrian Air Force in 1949, while 4 additional Dakotas were acquired between 1952 and 1956. In 1952, the airline was provided with 3 Douglas DC-3s and with 4 DC-4 in 1954, while in 1957 it received 4 Douglas DC-6s in the name of United Arab Airline. One of the older Dakotas crashed during its climb out of Aleppo's English Airport on February 24, 1956, amidst a heavy storm. The 19 people on board died in the airline's worst accident to date. Newer and stronger planes were consequently added to the fleet in the mid-50s. 2 Douglas DC-4 C-54 Skymasters, followed by a Douglas DC-4 1009 acquired from Swiss Air in December 1958, complementing an active fleet of 4 Douglas C-47 Dakotas. The network was expanded to Dhahran in the Persian Gulf, while frequencies were reinforced elsewhere. Merger with Misr. In February 1958, Syria and Egypt decided to unite under the leadership of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the 2 countries became provinces of the United Arab Republic. The merger between Syrian Airways and Misr, the state-owned airlines of Syria and Egypt, came as a consequence of this political union. The airlines merged on December 25, 1958, to form United Arab Airlines. At the time of the merger, Syrian Airways was still only a small regional airline, while its Egyptian counterpart, Misr, was the largest and oldest airline in the Arab world, operating operating an extensive network out of Cairo, the region's metropolis. During the UAE interlude, only regional and domestic routes were operated in Syria. Flights further afield connected at the Cairo hub. 2 planes inherited from Syrian Airways were written off between 1959 and 1961. The Douglas DC-4-1009, which was ditched in the Congo River as it was carrying cargo from Accra to Leopoldville on September 1, 1960, and a Dakota which crashed on its final approach of Kamishli on a domestic flight from Aleppo on May 6, 1961. Fortunately, there were no fatalities in either accident. The union between Egypt and Syria ended on September 26, 1961, amidst tensions between the leaderships of the 2 provinces of the UAR. The Syrian Arab Republic was declared in Syria, while Egypt chose to continue to carry the title of UAR for a few more years. In parallel to the divorce, Syria withdrew from UAE. All the airliners previously owned by Syrian Airways, 2 Douglas DC-6Bs and 1 Douglas DC-6B freighter were given up by UAE to the Syrian authorities. Rebirth of a national flag carrier. Syrian Arab Airlines were founded in October 1961 in order to take over UAE's operations in Syria and to become the new national airline. The fleet initially consisted of 3 Douglas C-47 Dakotas, 2 Douglas C-54 Skymasters, 2 Douglas DC-6Bs and 1 Douglas DC-6B freighter. Domestic and regional flights were promptly resumed, and the fleet originally was painted in a green livery reminiscent of that of the Syrian Airways. Colors: SAAL. Purchased a 3rd DC-6B from Shash in November 1962. Flights to European destinations were started in 1963, followed by flights to London and Paris, Karachi and Delhi in 1964. A new livery was introduced then, with alternating dark blue and red stripes for the cheat line. Syrian Arab Airlines became a founding member of the Arab Air Carriers Organization and entered the jet age in 1965, with the purchase of 2 Sud Aviation 210 Super Caravelle 10B3s. These beautiful jets enabled the airline to expand and reinforce its network with the addition of flights to Luxembourg, Prague, Athens, Istanbul, Tehran and Bahrain. A slightly altered livery was introduced for the occasion, removing the parallel stripes from the fin and removing the red stripes from the cheat line. In 1966, a pool partnership with Middle East Airlines Air Liban was signed and a twice-daily rotation between Beirut and Damascus was launched. The summer 1966 timetable below clearly reflects the airline's growth and modernization. In 1966, Syrian Arab Airlines used the Caravelles on flights to Europe as well as high-density Middle Eastern routes and on flights to South Asia. Routings were as follows: eastbound in Lebanon, Damascus, Aleppo, Beirut 3 times a week, Aleppo, Beirut 2x, Damascus, Beirut twice daily, Damascus, Jerusalem 2x, Damascus, Baghdad, Tehran 2x, Damascus, Jeddah 1x, Damascus, Kuwait 3x, Damascus, Bahrain 1x, Damascus, Doha, Sharjah 1x, Damascus, Doha, Sharjah, Karachi, Delhi 1x, Damascus, Dhahran, Sharjah, Karachi 1x, westbound, Damascus, Athens, Rome, Munich, London 1x, Damascus, Istanbul, Prague, Luxembourg 1x, Damascus, Nicosia 1x, Damascus, Athens, Munich, Paris, London 1x, Damascus, Aleppo, Istanbul, Luxembourg 1x, Damascus, Nicosia, Rome, Paris, London 1x, domestic, Damascus, Latakia X5, Damascus, Palmyra, Dar es Zor X3, Damascus, Dar es Zor, Aleppo 2x, Damascus, Dar es Zor 1x, Damascus, Aleppo, Kamishli X6, Damascus, Aleppo X5. Luxembourg is a rare destination for Middle Eastern carriers, except for cargo. SAAL's flights may have been in connection with Loftly-Dear's budget flights to North America. The Dakotas and Skymasters were still used on domestic routes as well as from the short flights to Beirut and Jerusalem. They will be retired from the fleet within the next year. Indiana 1967 South. AAL joined IATA, by which it was granted the serial number 70. The Dakotas and Skymasters were gradually withdrawn from the fleet, while the DC-6Bs were used for domestic and for a few short-haul regional flights. The 6 Days War disrupted SAAL's operations for several weeks in 1967, and the airline had to suspend its flights to Jerusalem. Beyond these immediate consequences on the airline, Syria's military defeat in 1967 left the whole country in a state of shock and had a decisive impact on the evolution of its political system for years to come. Nevertheless, SAAL's operations were gradually restored and a normal level of operation was recovered by 1968 as shown in the timetable below. The fleet consisted then of 2 Super Caravels and 3 DC-6Bs. Syrian Air takes off. With the beginning of the 70s, SAAL continued its steady development, introducing flights to Moscow in 1970 and purchasing another 2 Super Caravels from Sterling Airways in June 1971. Frequencies were increased. Flights to Jeddah were resumed the same year, while new flights were launched to Abu Dhabi, Benghazi and Budapest. Flights were disrupted for several weeks during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, following which Syrian sovereignty was restored in parts of the Golan Heights. A climate of confidence, pragmatism and political stability was nevertheless in sight in Syria after decades of volatile politics and coups d'état. Ambitious development programs were launched throughout the country. Syrian Arab Airlines was among the government's priorities as a new modernization and expansion program was launched. A new airport, the Damascus International Airport, was built 25 kilometers southeast of the capital and was opened to traffic in 1973 to become SAAL's modern hub, replacing the old Meze structure inherited from the French Mandate. A new SAAL livery was introduced in 1973, featuring the airline's new logo, a mythical bird rising over a Mediterranean blue disk. Closer economic and political ties with the Warsaw Pact countries led to the progressive build-up of a comprehensive network in Eastern Europe. With the addition of Bucharest, Prague and Berlin-Schönefeld, more flights to North Africa were added in 1974 with the introduction of Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers and Casablanca. Sanaa was also added to the network in 1974. In parallel to that, SAAL was managing an increasing number of Soviet-built aircraft for the Syrian government and the Syrian Air Force. That fleet was gradually expanded to include 2 Antonov An-24s, 6 Antonov An-26s, 6 Yakovlev Yak-40s and 4 Ilyushin Il-76 freighters, in addition to 2 French-built Dassault Mystère Falcon 20Fs and 1 Dassault Falcon 900. These aircraft were not used by the airline for scheduled services except for some of the Yak-40s, which replaced the Douglas DC-6B and the Caravels on domestic routes by the early 80s. In 1974, 2 Boeing 707s were leased in from British Airtows in order to complement the Caravel fleet. That year, the airline carried 279,866 passengers. A fleet renewal program was launched in 1975 as SAAL ordered 3 brand new Boeing 727-294s and 2 Boeing 747SPs, awaiting the delivery of its new planes. The airline leased Boeing 707s in order to improve its service offer. In all, 2 Boeing 707-420s and 6 Boeing 707-320s were leased in at various times between 1974 and 1976 and were used to reinforce frequencies and add new destinations to the network. The Syrian Air acronym was officially adopted on November 11, 1975, in anticipation of the delivery of the new Boeing fleet and in order to generate a more modern and international image. However, Syrian Air's official and legal title continues to be Syrian Arab Airlines to this day. The Boeing 727s supplemented the caravels throughout the network, while the Boeing 747SPs were used on high-load international routes. Demand was particularly high on these routes in 1976, especially following the repeated closures of the Beirut International Airport, and the increasing number of passengers using Damascus International Airport for travel to and from neighboring and war-stricken Lebanon. A record 480,000 passengers were carried by the airline in 1976. Given the predominantly medium-haul route network of the airline, the choice of the Boeing 747SP continues to this day to raise interrogations. The 2 jumbo jets were ordered in 1976 with the intention of operating transatlantic services to New York. Syrian Air and Alia, the Royal Jordanian airline, were to join forces in launching the first transatlantic route ever operated by an Arab Middle Eastern airline. The joint flight agreement never really materialized, and Alia launched independently its own Amman-New York flights in 1977. Syrian Air started its Boeing 747SP operations on June 1, 1976, using the jumbo jet on the Damascus-Munich-London sector. In 1980, Syrian Air sold 2 of its aging caravels as plans were made for the acquisition of newer aircraft. In 1981, the airline carried 510,000 passengers, but these numbers declined to 462,000 in 1982 following the unrest caused by Israel's invasion of nearby Lebanon. During the 70s, Syria Air managed to acquire a modern fleet, revamp its image and operate a profitable passenger network on 3 continents, largely satisfying the needs of the Syrian market. Its fares were accessible and attracted budget travelers flying between Europe and South Asia. The climate of stability and economic prosperity in Syria had a determining influence on the positive results of the airline. The 80s brought about new challenges to both Syria and its airline. Syrian Air welcomed the 80s with an active fleet of 3 Boeing 727s, 2 Boeing 747SPs, and 2 aging super caravels. The Yakovlev Yak-40s devoted to internal routes were mostly flown on behalf of the Syrian Air Force, while there was an obvious need to renew the fleet and to increase the airline's capacity. Mounting tensions between Syria and the West hampered the airline's modernization plans. There was a growing rift between the U.S. administration in particular and Syria. Both parties found themselves often at odds regarding a variety of regional issues, from the Iranian Revolution to the Palestinian cause to the raging conflict in Lebanon. These tensions ultimately resulted in economic sanctions voted by the U.S. Congress, which accused Syria of harboring and embracing illegal opposition movements. The sanctions, which became effective in the early 80s, apart from harming Syria's economy in general, prevented Syrian Air from buying newer Western equipment. This climate of difficult economics also resulted in a relatively austere on-board service and in the persistence of tedious multiple-leg routings, while competing airlines were offering non-stop frequent flights. Syrian Air had ultimately to resort to Soviet-built aircraft in order to expand its fleet. The Tupolev Tu-134s were introduced in 1983. In all, 6 Tu-134s were bought by Syrian Air, including 2 devoted for governmental missions. The Tu-134s were used along with the Caravels on low-yield regional and medium-haul flights and some domestic routes, while most of the domestic flights continued to be operated using the Yakovlev Yak-40s. 3 Tupolev Tu-154 megaseconds were acquired by Syrian Air between 1985 and 1986. They provided a well-needed boost to the Boeing 727 operations in Europe and the Persian Gulf region. The same difficult summer of 1985, flights to Beirut were restarted using the Super Caravels. In 1986, Syrian Air had to suspend flights to one of its long-standing and most important destinations, London, because of a diplomatic crisis between the UK and Syria following the Hindawi affair. The number of passengers carried by Syrian Air declined to 353,355 in 1988, the lowest since the mid-70s, forcing the airline towards more reform. The workforce was reduced by 1.5% to 3,526 in 1989. The number of passengers carried that year increased to 509,659. The workforce was reduced further to 3,615 in 1990. The number of passengers increased to 655,644, a record despite the war in Kuwait, and the airline was able to finish the year without losses, while sanctions and harsh economics kept it lagging way behind its competitors, and while the demise of the Soviet Union cast doubts on the future of its Tupolev fleet. Syrian Air's fortunes changed following the Second Gulf War in 1990. As Syria supported the U.S.-led coalition against the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, it regained some of its long-lost sympathy in Western hearts. Flights to London were resumed in 1991, and passenger numbers continued to increase to 700,819. The long-standing U.S. sanctions were eased in 1993, allowing the acquisition of modern Western equipment. Renewal and modernization 1994–present. In 1994, Kuwait donated to Syria 3 Boeing 727-269s, which enabled Syrian Air to finally phase out the 2 Caravels in December of the following year. In 1995, a record $71 million in operating profit was reported by the airline. The Tupolev operations were gradually scaled down, while new destinations were launched. In 1997, the airline took drastic measures in reducing its workforce to 2,331, as operating profits had declined to $44 million during the previous year. By 1998, the Tupolev Tu-134 were restricted to the Budapest, Beirut, Kuwait, Deir ez-Zor and Kamishli sectors, while the Tu-154s were still flown to Bucharest, Moscow, Istanbul, Cairo and Aleppo. In October 1998, Syrian Air received its first Airbus A320-232 YK-AKA and a new livery was unveiled for the occasion. 6 Airbus A320s were delivered to Syrian Air in all, allowing the withdrawal of the Tupolevs from regular service by 2000. The tupolews as well as the caravels were stored by the airline at Damascus International Airport. In 1999, flights between Aleppo and Beirut were inaugurated and service to Libya was resumed following the removal of the UN sanctions against that country. In 2000, Syrian Air operated a fleet of 14 aircraft, 6 Airbus A320s, 6 Boeing 727s and 2 Boeing 747 SPs, while it continued to use the Syrian Air Force Yakovlev Yak-40s for the domestic routes to Qamishli and Erezur. Flights to Vienna were inaugurated, while the resumption of Amman and Baghdad flights during that year would prove only temporary. According to the Syrian DGCA website, the airline carried 764,000 passengers that year. In 2003, the airline registered $9 million net profit thanks to its more economical fleet, and carried 907,850 passengers. Unprofitable routes were either scrapped or downscaled to seasonal operations. Thus, flights to Tehran, Bahrain, Doha and Muscat were operated only during the summer season. New markets were sought with the addition of Milan, Barcelona, Manchester, Copenhagen and Benghazi in 2004. Most of Syrian Air's flights are multiple-leg flights involving either a stop in Aleppo, a combination of international destinations with Fifth Freedom rights, or triangular routings. This route structure comes in sharp contrast to the current practices of modern airlines, which tend to focus on high-yield, high-frequency non-stop flights evolving around a strategic hub. The airline, which is just completing its fleet modernization, will also need to catch up with modern marketing methods, revamp its in-flight service and become more profit-conscious. With a workforce exceeding 4,000 employees, Syrian Air, which revenues nevertheless exceeded $171 million in 2003, remains overstaffed. In 2004, and despite a difficult regional situation and U.S. sanctions, the airline improved its performance, carrying 1.07 million passengers. Syrian Air carried close to 1.4 million passengers by 2005. However, the number of passengers being carried declined to less than 740,000 passengers by 2009. Plans were made for the renewal of the fleet with the possible acquisition of several new Airbus aircraft in order to replace the aging Boeing 727 and 747s. These plans were hampered by the reinforcement of a U.S.-led embargo against Syria, and fleet renewal using Russian equipment was being reconsidered. By 2012, Syrian Air had retired all its old Boeing 747,727 and Tupolev aircraft, leaving Syrian Air with just 8 aircraft in its fleet, 2 ATRs and 6 Airbus A320s. European and American sanctions. On the 23rd of July 2012, as the Syrian civil war continued, the European Union imposed a new wave of sanctions on Syria, which included sanctions on Syrian Air. The sanctions meant that the airline cannot conduct flights to the EU, or buy any new aircraft which contain European parts. As a result, Syrian Air was forced to suspend all its operations to the EU. The company is discussing a lawsuit against European Union countries since Syrian Airlines did not violate any laws nor did it jeopardize safety. However, EU ministers justified the sanctions on the airline because the company provides financial and logistical support for the Syrian government. Syrian Air has assured its customers that it is pursuing a court case with the European Union for unjust sanctions based on biased claims of transporting weaponry. This had been denied by Russia. If Syrian Air was flying weaponry to the Syrian government, it would be breaking major rules with ICAO. Claims have not been proven and the European Union has been discreet on the issue. Destinations. Codeshare agreements. Syrian Air had codeshare agreements with the following airlines. Fleet. Current fleet. The Syrian Air fleet consisted of the following as of December 2015. It also operates 2 Dassault Falcon 20s, 1 Dassault Falcon 900 and 2 Tupolev Tu-134Bs for the government, all of which are painted in Syrian Air livery. The company cannot purchase any new Airbus or Boeing planes, unless the United States and European Union lift the sanctions imposed on it. Syrian Air has maintained orders for new Tupolev, Ilyushin, and Antonov aircraft. However, an order for 10 Antonov 158 has been cancelled due to the Syrian civil war. Former fleet. Syrian Air's former fleet included Boeing 727-200s, Tupolev Tu-154s, Jack 40s and 2 Boeing 747SPs which were stored and are now broken up at King Khalid International Airport, Saudi Arabia. Incidents and accidents. The 20th of September 2012, an Airbus A320-200 flight RB501 from Damascus to Latakia during the climb encountered a mid-air collision with a military helicopter. The pilots of the helicopter were killed. The airliner returned to Damascus for a safe landing. Approximately half of the vertical stabilizer was broken off the A320. The helicopter crashed, killing 3 on board.